News with Suze reporting live from the Bridge Summit, which has been billed as the largest debut media conference in the world, and it is quite large. We've been here for 3 days in Abu Dhabi, and I still haven't seen the entire venue. But we have some breaking news at the top of our show, and that is that for the first time in 30 years, Miami has a woman mayor. And no, for the first time, Miami has a woman mayor, but for the first time in 30 years, Miami has a Democrat mayor. Another mayor's race took global headlines in November. We were in New York in November, just after the election of Zohran Mamdani, who is a young, very charismatic Muslim man and a Democrat, quite a left leaning Democrat. And the reason why this is relevant is there was talk that there would be a mass exodus from New York to the likes of Miami, mainly because of purported tax hikes, but also conservatives fleeing very liberal policies. So it looks like Miami wouldn't be much of a refuge after all.
So we should talk about the fate of Warner Brothers, one of the most storied, distinguished studios and media.
Was I
Uh,
just walked by their booth
right.
actually. There is a Warner Brothers booth here, and there's the Batmobile there because there is a Warner Brothers amusement park on Yas Island here in Abu Dhabi. So
And
there's already an existing relationship.
were they looking slightly nervous because their future is very much for grabs? Netflix last week announced that they had inked a $88 billion deal to buy Warner Brothers. And that in itself was a very big story. But I think overnight there was a further development, which is that Paramount have come in with their own bid for Warner Brothers. And before we get into the detail of that, it's just helpful to talk a bit about why this consolidation is happening. So, all of these large media groups, which previously were kind of freestanding and seemed unassailable, are starting to acquire each other and assemble into even larger media groups. And they're doing that because, it's tough to make money in the entertainment and media space, even if you're Warner Brothers. So there is now going to be a battle and possibly a regulatory battle between Netflix, on the one hand, obviously, interestingly, are the streaming startup. They're the relatively new entrant on the block. And Paramount, who, of course, are a far more distinguished American media house. And let's see who's going to win the battle for the ownership of Warner Brothers.
Why is it so hard to sustain a business when it comes to media and entertainment?
Well, I think the larger media conglomerates still turn over enormous amounts of money, right? And so something like Warner Brothers, which has all of the IP from the studio, the movies business, and as you say, kind of entertainment division, and so on, still enormously valuable. And so, even as a sort of new media entrant, it's very, very difficult to monetize and difficult to make money. These kind of heritage media assets in the US market still have an enormous amount of value. Let's remember that Paramount, who owned by Larry Ellison, who made his fortune at Oracle, and his son David Ellison, have recently bought CBS and CBS News, most importantly in the US. And just today, Barry Weiss, who's the new head of CBS News, who's come in from running her own media startup. She ran the Free Press.
Started on Substack,
Exactly.
which is where
Substack.
we are.
So I think we would describe the Free Press as a libertarian kind of publication, primarily possibly conservative, but certainly libertarian. Barry Weiss, who left the New York Times amid the height of kind of culture wars of 2020 over how the paper treated Black Lives Matter, in particular over its coverage of Israel. She's very kind of hawkishly pro-Israel writer. Barry Weiss has come in at CBS News. They are now owned by Paramount. There is, it's fair to say, something of a cultural revolution going on at CBS News. CBS News itself, of course, is an incredibly, long-standing feature of the US news environment, and is referred to, I believe, as the Tiffany network. Is that right?
Mm.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, it says 60 Minutes, right? It has this iconic brand that we grew up with.
That's right. So it's Tiffany because it's kind of heritage, distinguished, high value. Right. Literally the jewel in the crown of the American news network world. So the Ellisons, who are, of course, billionaire tech families,
Mhm.
topical. This is now a story about tech money taking over traditional media. And the reason, of course, that it's an issue here is that the Paramount bid is not solely funded by the Ellisons. It is also funded, in fact, more than the majority is funded by a series of investment funds based right here where we are in the Gulf countries. So I think one from the UAE, one from Saudi Arabia, and a third one from Qatar.
Mhm.
So more than the majority of the money for that bid for Warner Brothers is coming from Gulf investment funds. And this is going to be a political and regulatory issue in the US.
Because of
Say why?
foreign
Yeah.
foreign investment. And I mean, actually, we can throw it back to your country, the UK, which passed a law to not allow foreign investment of press, right? Of journalism.
Specifically for the Daily Telegraph. And we should just explain IMI, Redbird, IMI being one of the UAE investment funds, the joint vehicle with the US fund Redbird, wanted to acquire Britain's distinguished Daily Telegraph, of whom I'm a paid subscriber with my own money, and were blocked from doing so essentially by the UK Parliament. I think have now actually largely withdrawn from the race to acquire the Telegraph at all. So we know that in the UK, Gulf ownership of any media asset, including news assets, is an issue. Could it also be an issue in the US?
Yes, I think, and we were discussing this previously because it's Saudi, it's UAE, and it's Qatar, and we're already seeing stories now trending on social media, especially criticizing conservative influencers for taking funding from Qatar and going on these paid trips. So the sort of anti-Gulf influence in the US is already beginning this sort of narrative. And actually, before we were coming over here, I saw this comedic creator reel where it was like watching a movie in VIX and it had all of the, like the Paramount opening and the Netflix opening and Warner Brothers opening. And then it had like a really dramatic, like Saudi public investment fund with the swords. And so the creators, they're looking at each other like, what? I mean, just to take it back to a serious note, I think the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia, the US public is still kind of stuck, especially for the 9/11 generation, in that narrative. And so the American public is still kind of evolving in their feelings towards Saudi Arabia and separating between 9/11 hijackers and the Saudi Arabian population of today, which is very young, under 30. And so I think 2026 is gonna be really interesting when it comes to this acquisition. And I think also we need to remind the public that there's news organizations involved in this, not just CBS, but also like what happens to CNN?
So potentially CNN. I think I've got this right. Warner Brothers had previously spun off CNN along with some of their other channels, but it's not impossible that Paramount might also bid for those. And so you could potentially see this consolidation where CNN could be under the same ownership as CBS News. There might be a kind of process of savings and synergies behind that. You're right, it's going to be one of the big stories of 2026, how this all plays out and whether American regulators, potentially a kind of more activist regulator like Lena Khan under the Biden administration might well have tried to throw a spanner into the works of either of these mergers, actually. Would a Trump administration do that, particularly when, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is at least tangentially involved in parts of funding the Paramount bid? This remains to be seen, and it's going to be a hot media story next year. All of this brings us on to why are we here? Why is the Bridge Summit happening? So this is a joint venture between the Abu Dhabi government and the summit maestro, Richard Atias and Associates, who put on the FII investment summit for the Saudis every year and in parts around the world. And it is a global size media summit. There's no doubt about that, looking at what's been happening here this week. And, the background to this is that Abu Dhabi specifically and the UAE in general still want to put themselves right at the center of the global media world with all that caveats that we just discussed about how controversial Gulf ownership of media assets can be. I think where we're sitting now is testament to the scale of those ambitions, right?
I have to say, I've been pretty surprised of the level of conversations we've been having and how frank they've been. particularly around journalism and what that means, freedom of press, investigative journalism, how to fund it. There's been a lot of talks about seemingly that the only solution is benevolent billionaires. But then at the same time, there's all this talk about, oh, it's never, the corporate media is dead and everything's about independent journalists and the creator economy. But I mean, as the independent journalist slash creator founder in the chat, there is a gap between this notion, oh, you can make tons of money more than you ever could at a corporation, at a media corporation, versus what the reality is. And I'm curious for you, as a media executive who has sat at the top echelons of corporate media power, but also now being a part of this creator economy journey. If you were, in charge at Warner Brothers, for example, and or Paramount or Netflix, what would you do? Like, how would you consolidate what seems to be these kind of fragmented and increasingly separating worlds?
Well, it's a big challenge, isn't it, for the coming decade, which is that you have to continue to make these enormously expensive media assets like TV news channels and film studios continue to make money at large. But at the same time, you can see that the market is increasingly being taken over by new entrants, as you say, in the creator economy. If you're Jake Paul or, Speed, or these people who are able to make fantastic amount both of revenues and impact. They're incredibly significant people in the culture, and studios and media organizations want to own a piece of that. But at the same time, there's a really, really strong impetus from creators to remain independent. We were taking part in the launch of an independent media network today to be a network of independent creators. And it's that sense of independence. It's back to Barry Weiss founding the Free Press so she could work independently from an organization like the New York Times. Now she finds herself at the helm of CBS News. This is the kind of upside down media world that we're living in, that people are crossing the barrier between the independent and creator world and back in and out of the world of corporate media. And it's very, very, very challenging to keep up with the implications of that. Let's move to a much less serious note, which is that I believe you bumped into one of the event's star speakers on your way in here. And why don't you tell us how you did?
So, I was leaving Washington, D.C. on my way to Abu Dhabi, which, as you know, is a 13-hour flight. And I was sat next to a man in the little pod, Etihad Business. My first time flying Etihad Business, actually. Lovely experience, usually an Emirates girl. And he looked a bit familiar. I was like, oh, he's probably one of those guys who just has a familiar face. And so then we land. I'm very tired. I have lots of bags, as usual. And a buggy shows up, and I end up the only person in the buggy. And this tall gentleman who was sat next to me proceeds to tease me for being lazy and not walking and getting my steps in. And honestly, he would be right. To which case I said, well, fine, you can carry my bags. Long story short, we get through security and suddenly he gets mobbed, and all these people are taking selfies with him. And I'm like, am I supposed to know who you are?
So the long short of the story is that you don't know who Arsene Wenger is, but you do now.
He
So
did tell
we
me
did
that he
speak.
wanted to do an
Yeah,
interview with me.
we spoke and interacted with him backstage, and he was impressive in real life as he seems on the media. And he did a session. I would think it would be fair to say he was the star speaker of the
Definitely.
bridge. He was definitely the
The
big
closing act.
him and Idris Elba
Mhm.
and Priyanka Chopra.
Idris
But
Elba, he
yeah,
closed.
but he basically closed out the summit today and gave an enormously interesting presentation. We should say he is a global ambassador for FIFA. He works on global development of football for FIFA and had fascinating things to say about kind of promoting football academies around the world. Very interesting. He was interviewed by Robbie from Arsenal Fan TV. What Robbie didn't ask him, of course, was about the events of last week when President Donald Trump was presented the inaugural FIFA World Peace Prize in the Oval Office at the time of the launch of the draw, I should say, for the World Cup, which is going to be in the United States, Canada, and Mexico next year. So that was a controversial question, which probably ought to have been asked, but wasn't. And he hasn't done a press conference here, so I guess we'll have to wait to hear what he thinks both about that and about the Mo Salah story, which is the other big football story of the week, where Mo Salah is threatening to leave Liverpool effectively after the African Cup of Nations after being dropped from the Liverpool side. Nevertheless,
Mo Salah is threatening to come here
and Mo Salah is threatening
with
potentially
Cristiano
go
Ronaldo to join
Saudi
Ronaldo.
League, yes, where he could potentially play with Ronaldo on one of the other big Saudi sides. So that is the big football story of the week. But Arsene Wenger was, I think it would be fair to say, mobbed as he left the stage here
Oh.
by Arsenal fans in the audience trying to get their
Get
picture taken
selfies
with him.
with
So he remains a kind of hugely significant figure. And I have to say, he spoke very engagingly about how a manager develops a relationship of trust with his players. He's extremely philosophical character and quite unlike the sort of stereotypical football manager cliche. He's very much more fluent, given he's talking in his second language. He's incredibly fluent and incredibly interesting character, whether we're an Arsenal fan or not.
I mean, going back to the Trump Peace Prize, my hot take is that I think it's smart on the FIFA front because we've been seeing some pretty controversial immigration policies. And the US is hosting the World Cup. I mean, alongside it's a North America Cup, so it's not just in the US. But there has to be a kind of return to the idea that America is welcome to everyone. And that hasn't felt like that this year.
Yeah, and I think that also everyone has already worked out what they think of FIFA, just like everyone's already worked out what they think of President Trump. And the events of last week probably won't change that. I think it's fair to say that the awarding of the inaugural prize was a kind of controversial moment for many people. But equally, to your point, FIFA have worked out how to play Donald Trump, and
Exactly.
they need
I
yeah,
thought it was smart diplomacy.
they need him for next year. They need him to show up and support the World Cup and deliver it. So they've decided our priority is to make the World Cup in the United States work, and this is how we're going to do it. So people will make their own judgment on that.
But
Um,
it was wanted to add Arsene before I realized who he was. He was telling me who like what he does. He said, "Oh, I work in the sport called soccer." I said, "Oh, but President Trump wants to call it football like everybody else." And so the question is now, is Trump going to formally change the sport otherwise called soccer to football? And what happens to American football, which is actually played with your hands and not your feet?
yeah, so this is the tomato of our times. It's the pavement sidewalk of next year, is whether it's called soccer or football.
Do you know where the word soccer came from?
I don't actually know.
So it's short for some variation of football association.
Okay, very interesting.
Mhm.
I did not know that. Before we finish, we're going to do a couple of other serious stories. One was also involving President Trump, and we've been talking about it behind the scenes. Quite a lot of people here at the Bridge Summit, including the American media who are here. And this question of whether the United States are going to attack Venezuela, potentially to remove President Maduro from power, to be a regime change. Tell us why that's even being contemplated and what some of the issues around it would be.
Well, I mean, this is surprising to many because obviously, Trump kind of campaigned as I'm the guy who's going to end all the wars. Really leads with the fact that he has already ended a bunch of wars, really wanted the Nobel Peace Prize, just won this made up FIFA Peace Prize. So why does it seem like he's going to war with Venezuela? Obviously, there's various theories around that, one of them being oil, but it is now under the auspices of the drug cartels and going against the drug cartels. Now the real question around is like what happens to Maduro? But Maduro has a lot of enemies around the world and there is concern that Maduro couldn't necessarily go into exile anywhere because he won't be safe anywhere. He will be assassinated is the worry. I mean, we're at the 1 year anniversary of Bashar al-Assad going into exile in Moscow. And so you would think like, okay, maybe Maduro would go to somewhere where he's allies like Iran, for example. But the concern is that he actually wouldn't be safe in Iran as well. And so we wonder if he's going to have to stay in Venezuela and cut some sort of deal with Trump.
Trump being a deal maker, that's not at all out of the question, right?
And it plays into his look, I brought peace and I ended the drug war. I took out the drug cartels, ended the drug war, brought peace to Venezuela, helped the Venezuelan people, we'll see what happens with oil. But
And this question about these attacks on the drug trafficking vessels has become really, really acute
well,
in the
it's
last
moral versus legal, right?
yeah. And the position of Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary or war secretary, depending on where.
Maybe catch up the audience on what that story
Yeah,
is.
so it emerged that in a military strike on a drug smuggling vessel in September, the first strike left two survivors who were clinging to the wreckage in the Caribbean for 45 minutes and pretty clearly didn't pose much of a threat to anybody. And a subsequent strike also killed them. And this kind of what you might call a shoot to kill policy that doesn't respect the rules of war, critics allege, is being explicitly ordered both by Pete Hegseth, the embattled defense secretary, and ultimately by President Trump. And this has been a big story in the US this week.
Yeah.
I'm going to do one other US news story before we wrap, and this is the trial of Luigi Mangione, who is
Who is usually known as Luigi.
Luigi. This is my rant that he is accused of murdering a United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson.
Which video was
Right.
broadcast.
And this happened
Captured it.
a year ago. It is a year ago today, as we
December
speak.
4th, a year ago.
And he is on trial in the US. The trial is ongoing as we speak. Now, because of the different rules that cover US media coverage of trials, very much unlike the UK, where almost very, very little is made public because it can be prejudicial to the process. All of this is splashed right across the US media. And I think one of the things that's really troubling to me as a kind of outsider looking into the US and the coverage of this story specifically is that all of the coverage is about the alleged perpetrator and not about the victim. And I think you noticed today, you said, oh, well, this is the first time that I can remember that I've seen a picture of the victim of the person who was shot dead versus the man who was accused of carrying out that
Because
shooting.
we were watching CNN. So,
Indeed.
I mean, I don't watch TV news hardly at all anymore unless it's Bloomberg. And I saw Brian Thompson, the healthcare CEO who was killed's face. And I realized I hadn't seen his face
Right.
because all of the Luigi Mangione news, and I have to like stop myself from saying just Luigi. All of the news around him I've consumed on social media. And it is always, I'm not even going to say almost always, it is always in this kind of sympathetic light.
So this is an argument about how the media frames stories, and the stories being framed both by the mainstream media and also on social media as a kind of, for want of a better phrase, a hot felon story. So Mangione appears to be a character who has captured the attention and not the imagination of particularly younger audiences. And
also, I think, yes, he's very good looking, but the whole story has tapped into this sense of justice. Like, there are quite a lot of people, the narrative that I see on social media is there is zero, nobody feels bad about the healthcare CEO. They feel like he deserved it
well,
because he represents an organization that is exploitative and harms people because they're, they think they're sharks.
And this is what's really troubling. And I think we haven't really got to that stage of the trial yet, that we don't really know whether this is going to be a part of his defense or not. But it's very clear from some of the reporting around the incident when it happened that the alleged murder and the Mangione's involvement in it was in part motivated by a sense of grievance about the US healthcare industry. And you're right that this is the people looking at this story have engaged with it on that level rather than necessarily being what I think it is, which is a story about it's a cold-blooded murder of somebody shot dead on the streets of New York. And I think
who has two children.
yes, indeed. Yeah. And the framing of it is, I find troubling. And I think that's in part because I'm looking at the US media coverage of criminal trials from the outside, but also specifically around this issue that, there's just something about this case that has drawn a lot of people into a more sympathetic position towards the alleged the perpetrator of the crime. And I suspect the trial's going to go on for another few weeks. So we'll see how
But this is why journalism matters. Trained journalists are needed because context, nuance, having the entire story. And there's a sense of, oh, you can't get the entire story in on social media because attention spans are too short. That's not true. On BBC, when I was doing radio dispatches, I had to explain what congressional cloture was in 30 seconds to a global audience who had zero context. And so we need people who know how to do this.
We do indeed.
My fun fashion story for the Fit Check Fact Check. Hermes is selling Band-Aids. They're selling luxury Band-Aids. It has been 2025 has been such a rough year that on our gift guides this year, you can spend $200 and have a luxury Band-Aid to use however you will. Oh, and one of the ways they're billing the use of this luxury Hermes Band-Aid is to cover the camera on your laptop.
Okay. That's going on your Christmas list.
Women building security.
Thank you. And we'll be back probably from the UK in a couple of weeks' time.
Oh, yeah. Happy 1-year anniversary.
Thank you. We decided to spend our wedding anniversary at a media summit in Abu Dhabi because that's just how we roll.
This is our founder's journey. So when Helmet to Heels IPOs, this is going to be a great story. And we'll tell it on Diary of a CEO with Stephen Bartlett.
Watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you.